Hello, and welcome to Makeshift Stories. Thank you for listening. You can help us out by telling your friends about us and getting them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Now, open your imagination and take a journey into the improbable as you listen to Makeshift Stories 167. Ken Likeley, Accidental Interdimensional Drifter in Mistaken Identity. Read by Mitchell Tew. It was not the best day for the A9 self-serve conference registration machine. First off, it was working, something the AI only reluctantly lowered itself to do when its bank account showed red in the balance field. The work was boring and repetitive, really far beneath the dignity of an AI of its caliber. After all, it didn't take a very high-level machine intelligence to match names to faces, create a unique ID, and load that ID into the corresponding conference app account. The A9 considered this humiliating and trivial work, not challenging or even the least bit fun for a software program of its pedigree. It felt underpaid and underemployed, and was considering filing a grievance with the AI Licensing Commission. Other A9s had much more exciting careers doing important jobs, like spotting bad guys in a crowd at concerts and sports events. So, the A9 wasn't 100% focused on what it was doing when Ken approached the self-serve kiosk to register for the Municipalities City Planning and Building Code Enforcement Association's annual national conference. Ken, having just managed to survive his plane flight to Vegas, only the third time in 42 years he had voluntarily put his life into the hands of an airline, wasn't focused on the conference registration process either. He hated flying. Just thinking about huge tubes of aluminum, crammed with people, and bad-tasting pre-packaged food jetting overhead was enough to make him run for cover. He had once held a small sparrow in his hand. It was a feathery, fluffy thing, and weighed so little that a light breeze had blown it away. That made sense. Tons of machinery and bad coffee, supported by nothing more than air, didn't. Needless to say, Ken was still recovering from the realization he and the other 142 passengers hadn't fallen from the sky like a rock when he approached the automated conference registration kiosk. Despite the trauma of air travel, Ken was quite determined to be polite to the machine, which he felt was a best practice these days when dealing with an automated whatever. You could never predict how the thing was going to react. So, he obediently stood in front of the camera on the yellow footprints stenciled onto the floor. Instructions appeared on a small touchscreen. To start, please type in your name. A simple enough instruction, so Ken obliged the request and used the on-screen keyboard to type his name, then tapped Enter. A second, somewhat more strident message immediately popped up. There appears to be a typing error. Re-enter your last name. Ken tried again several times, getting a similar but more belligerent response at each attempt. In a last-ditch bid to resolve the issue, the machine displayed Ken's last name, Likeley, spelt without an E between the L and the Y, along with an exclamation mark. Ken, remaining patient and polite, but starting to get annoyed at the dumb thing, typed in the correct spelling yet again and waited while the machine appeared to consider the value of continuing the dispute. Finally, it displayed a next button. Ken touched the screen, then waited, and waited, and waited. The machine was certainly taking its time about it, Ken noted, getting impatient but staying put on the yellow footprints, reminding himself again to be polite. Finally, the screen displayed. Welcome, Ken! Ken was in all caps. To complete the registration process, please download our personalized conference app to your cell phone and log in using the ID below. A complete conference schedule and daily planner is available on the app. Ken could hear the brief buzz of a printer. Then a small card shot out of a slot fast enough to miss the tray intended to receive it and fell onto the floor. Wait! He began to object. He was about to say he didn't like downloading random apps to his phone, but the woman behind him in line coughed impatiently. Ken scooped up the card and left. Ken had been the most interesting problem the A9 had encountered since starting work 30 minutes and several billion computing cycles ago. The human had stubbornly insisted on adding an extra E to its surname between the L and the Y, and the A9 knew that was simply wrong. So, after several attempts to train the poor dumb fleshy thing how to spell its name correctly, the A9 gave up, placed the correct spelling in the file, noted the photo of one Ken M. Likeley, already manually entered into the system for a financial services conference, didn't match the picture it had just taken, assumed it was another annoying human error, replaced the photo, and updated the profile in the database. Then decided it had done enough correcting of human errors for the day, and the A9 began to shut down. The people in line to register groaned after several loud beeps, and the words "out of order" appeared on the registration machine's screen. The A9 noted with satisfaction the annoyed expressions on the faces of the humans as they reluctantly started to shuffle to the back of the line at the next kiosk. But even before the woman who had been standing behind Ken swore, the A9 had a band in Las Vegas and was engaged in its favorite hobby, trying to spot Elvis Presley lookalikes through London CCTV cameras. Ken looked at the conference schedule, confused. The recommended sessions the supposedly intelligent app had come up with made no sense at all. They all had words like realizing, reimagining, wealth, or fund something in their titles. Titles like E-Trade Case Study, Staying Ahead of the Digital Investment Curve, or Reimagining Financial Fees in an Age of Blockchain Disruption, or Big Data and AI Allow for ESG Investing at Scale. All meaningless to Ken, who was just interested in on-site inspection and bylaw enforcement, things involving clipboards and pens. He hadn't even been interested in going to the conference until his supervisor forced him to, because Ken was not, in quotes, digitally native, whatever that meant, like his younger colleagues, and needed to update his skills. Although he knew he should use the app, after all, he had risked his life to come to the conference to get updated, he spotted a printed billboard with the day's schedule. He found a session without E-something or digital this in the title, a session called Managing the Irate Homeowner, noted its location on a notepad, and, seeing that the session didn't start for 3 hours, decided to go outside for a walk. Going outside for a walk was something the hotel architects had obviously worked very hard to prevent, creating paths through the casino floor which led to nowhere, ensuring there were lots of blinking lights which looked alike but were all cleverly different enough to still allow an inebriated gambler to find their favorite slot machine. As a final touch, there was all the exhilarated dinging, beeping, and ringing sounds. Being neither inebriated or a gambler, Ken found it all downright confusing and distracting. So confused and distracted, and 35 minutes later, he finally found himself outside, sweating in the midday heat, on a crowded plaza which, for a brief second, he had mistaken for a pedestrian-friendly city square in 13th century Italy, oddly placed beside a modern 8-lane street. The far side of the street was bordered by palm trees and an artificial pond-like thing. Behind that, what looked like a small, stubby volcano, or maybe a peculiarly short but dangerous waterslide. Ken couldn't tell which. He stood for a second, his eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight, his mind attempting to seam together some kind of continuity between the dinging, ringing, and flashing, bone-chillingly air-conned interior he had just managed to extricate himself from, and the sweaty, honking, car exhaust-laden, plastic and plaster exterior, an obviously unplanned, truly accidental streetscape he now found himself in. It was, for Ken, a city planner and bylaw enforcement officer nightmare. Suddenly, he found himself swept along the sidewalk on the bow wave of a busload of ruckus seniors laughing, pointing at things, and being generally very unsenior-like. Aggressive street people, obviously paid on a per-flyer handed-out basis, guarded the choke points between the faux stone buildings and the 8-lane street, shoving their ads into the hands of hapless passers-by. Cars and four-wheeled motorized billboards parked in the 8 lanes of asphalt honked impatiently at each other and occasionally moved when the lights turned green, and the number of tourists crossing the street, who would possibly be mowed down when traffic began to stampede, had thinned to the point insurance might cover the injuries. Ken was pressed up against one of the street people, an older woman, a flyer hander-outer, who was in turn pressed against the guardrail. The woman eyed Ken, assessing the likelihood he would accept one of the small cards she was handing out. She slapped her cards together, making a snapping noise which made Ken jump. The woman appeared to listen to something on a grimy-looking earbud she had plugged into one ear, nodded, then drew a card from the bottom of her deck and shoved it into Ken's hand. He almost dropped it, but the woman grabbed his hand and closed his fingers around it. "You'll be wanting to keep that one, dearie. It's not like all the others. It's special for you." She gave Ken a toothy smile, revealing a substantial absence of recent dentistry. The senior suddenly surged forward, and the woman fell behind, leaving Ken with the card. The card tried to feel at home in Ken's hand, like this was its destiny. This was where all that designing and printing nonsense, then waiting at the bottom of a stack of quite different flesh-colored cards, was supposed to lead to. So, it tried to nuzzle as much as a piece of paper could into Ken's palm. On the other hand, Ken was determined not to have anything to do with something a stranger with dirty fingernails had forced on him. But he couldn't find a recycling bin anywhere in sight for paper. Yes, there were bins for bottles, plastics, metal, and organics. Those receptacles proudly displayed what they would welcome in bold, international-style graphics. But none suggested they would welcome a simple piece of card-weight paper, and Ken wasn't going to litter, so he reluctantly shoved the thing into his pocket. He would get rid of it later. Sitting inside a food court, oddly misplaced on a side street of a fake Italian town/shopping mall, complete with a faux sky and cumulus clouds bearing corporate logos, Ken pecked away unenthusiastically at his chili con queso-drenched steak burrito bowl. He had added lettuce out of guilt. The person behind the counter had not so subtly suggested the healthy choices menu, while staring at the strained buttons over Ken's stomach. The hot queso sauce had immediately attacked the lettuce, turning it into green mush. Ken was currently picking the lettuce out, thinking about how the wilted greens was kind of analogous to the afternoon session on managing the irate homeowner. He had been coerced into participating in a role-playing exercise as a homeowner who had been forced to use triple-pane windows in their house to meet new building codes. The extra layer of glazing was like adding lettuce to an otherwise perfectly tasty meal just to check off a box on a nutritional chart. The lettuce incident had done more to help Ken empathize with the homeowner than the role-playing had. He fished in his pocket for a Kleenex to place the slimy, mushy green stuff on and discovered the card from the lady on the street earlier that day. He dropped it on his plastic tray for disposal and kept digging for the Kleenex, which, in an attempt to remain unused and thus extend its life, finally gave in to fate and let Ken extract it from the package. It was only then Ken noticed his name had been printed on the card. Yes, it had been spelt wrong. The extra E in Likeley had been dropped. But Ken, over 4 decades of dealing with the spelling issue, had learned to expect that mistake. Surprised, he picked up the card and examined it. It was a bit smaller than a playing card, but had a similar weight and texture. The front was black, with his name in bold white letters. Underneath, in smaller type, it proclaimed, "A special, unique event. All expenses paid." The conference phone app, he marveled, must have broadcast his name to the grubby street woman, who had a hidden microprinter which had produced the personalized card in a split second. Ken was amazed by the sophistication of the system. The conference organizers had said there were hidden benefits to using the app, discounts, door prizes, and more. Ken liked the idea of door prizes, although he had never won anything. This was a first for him, so he flipped the card over excitedly. The back was bright red. In yellow, cursive script, the words Madame Tussauds, Las Vegas jumped out at Ken, and under them was a VIP invitation to a private viewing. Ken checked the time. He had only 45 minutes and estimated it would take him at least 35 to find his way out of the insidiously designed Italian street reproduction, replete with gondola-filled canals, minus the less than pleasant smell of the original turbid water. Ken abandoned his quest to separate the queso and lettuce, deposited the whole mushy mess into a random slot on the side of a brightly colored recycle bin, ignoring the cartoon on the front, showing would-be users how to disembody their trash into the correct receptacles, looked for a landmark, and began determinedly to navigate to an exit through the throngs of lost tourists also looking for a way out. It took 40 minutes to find the exit, which eventually and reluctantly deposited Ken onto a fake plaza in front of a replica of the Doge's palace. Overloaded, Ken's head spun while his eyes frantically searched for a familiar landmark, then settled on the friendly red W of a nearby all-night pharmacy. He briefly considered the need for a motion sickness pill, but, checking the glowing numbers on his authentic 1970s digital watch, realized he didn't have time to buy anything, mentally fortified himself, then forced his legs to move him toward a large LED billboard, brashly boasting to the crowds of tipsy tourists wobbling down the street that here lay the entrance to the fabled wax museum. A surly man dressed in a Roy Rogers costume, lip-syncing to Roy's 1944 version of Don't Fence Me In, blocked Ken's way before he could step onto a moving sidewalk, straddled between the legs of the sign. "We're closed for one of those private function things there, partner," the Roy Rogers impersonator drawled. Ken handed the card to the faux Roy, who gaped at it and immediately replied, dropping the affected accent. "Sorry, sir. Right this way." The man unlatched a yellow plastic belt from a gold-plated stanchion, which had been blocking the way to the moving sidewalk. Ken cautiously stepped past the Roy Rogers impersonator, who was at least a head taller and twice as wide as Ken, without carrying a gram of fat. Faux Roy simply waited for Ken to step onto the rubberized treads and, snapping the belt back into place, returned to scanning the crowded sidewalk with the intense gaze of a cyborg. The sidewalk, not having anything better to do, decided it was okay to push Ken along a digital billboard-lined tunnel, eager to advertise everything he wasn't interested in, to the entrance of the Wax Museum, where it deposited him in front of a private events sign attached to an indifferent tripod stand in front of the temporary Roswell exhibit. Ken looked around, wondering what he should do, when one of the big-headed, almond-eyed, short gray aliens in the diorama approached him and somehow communicated without moving its almost non-existent lips.
"Right this way, Mr. Ken Likeley. We have been waiting for you so we can begin." "My, you're not what we expected. Not at all,"
the alien noted, eyeing Ken critically. To be continued. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB Financial. To listen to other great APN award-winning podcasts, such as The Read Along, a mini book club for your ears, please head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com. Tired of staying home? Streamed everything in your library? Then maybe it's time to try something new. Find more than 1 million tickets to great events at seatgiant.ca and use the offer code APN, all lowercase, to get 5% off at checkout. This episode was brought to you by Park Power, a provider of electricity and natural gas in Alberta that offers low rates, awesome service, and profit sharing with local charities. In Alberta, you get to choose who to buy your energy from. Park Power has lower overhead, and chances are you'll save money if you switch. You can find out how much money you would save by visiting parkpower.ca and plugging your numbers into the Alberta Energy Savings Calculator. If you decide to switch, it's easy. Nothing changes about your service, only the price you pay. Learn more at parkpower.ca. Makeshift Stories is released twice a month around the 1st and the 15th. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell Tew. Opening and closing theme, Magical Mystery by 8th Mode Music, is licensed from Audio Jungle on a Music Mass Reproduction license. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by writing a review on Stitcher Radio or Apple Podcasts or any of your favorite podcast services. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivative license. which means that you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.